much, ladies and gentlemen. As Andrea said, I'm Shane Coughlan. I'm a General Assembly member at Free Software Foundation Europe. I've been involved in issues around free software governance for over a decade now. I've dealt with issues around copyright, trademarks, patents, and supply chain management. Now, when Harald and I were invited to come to this wonderful conference in this wonderful country, we talked about how we could best explain to your part of the community about why we think compliance is interesting and vital. And we decided to cover it by discussing, firstly, the business strategy aspect of compliance, and then the engineering perspective of compliance. I'm doing the business part, and I'm going to make the case for why this is an issue of strategic investment for a company. Aligning yourself with community best practices isn't just a cost center or something to regard as a pain point. It's part of your investment in getting optimal returns from engagement with free software. Let's run through that a bit. Let's do the big picture. Companies doing software today really have two choices. One is building platform components on their own, and the other is sharing a massive global resource to accelerate innovation. And that choice exists, but it's not really a choice at all. Obviously, the second option sounds more appealing. The value of free software isn't that there's free code out there that you can download off the internet. For a business, the value is the multiples of engineering investment that it offers you. Free software is a great approach for stakeholders to compete on the products that they bring to market, but collaborate on the platforms that they all need to create those products. In other words, they can collaborate on areas where they don't have differentiation and compete effectively, more effectively, on the areas where they do have differentiation. It's a simple but extremely important business case for why free software has been successful. Free software ultimately provides value by reducing your development cost and your time to market. For every company that plays in free software and engages effectively, that's what happens, and that's why they keep doing it. Now, let's talk numbers, and I think this is kind of important when we're talking about scale here. Way back when, 8 years ago, Linux Foundation estimated that it would cost over $10 billion to recreate a Linux distribution like Fedora 9. If you were to re-engineer that code, you're going to have to invest over $10 billion. That was kind of the tipping point where it became clear that free software as a methodology for producing software, platform software, was providing value that virtually no company could afford to create on its own. Since then, we have truly gone mainstream. Black Duck do a survey every year where they talk with the people using free software and people not using free software. They take the pulse of the software industry. And last year's survey indicated that 78% of companies run some or all of their operations on free software infrastructure. And 88% of companies expect to increase their project contributions in the community. Tremendous uptake, unquestionably broad uptake of this approach to technology. The projects hosted by Linux Foundation alone, a very small subset of the projects around the world, have a combined value as of the end of last year of around $5 billion. That would take 1,300 plus developers 30 years to recreate. Now, I brought up those numbers to make a very clear underline that when you say free software delivers tremendous value, it's clear, it's empirical, it's proven. Free software is in enterprise, embedded, consumer, automotive, mobile. It's free software that has eaten software that is everywhere. It is the heart of IT today. And everyone who plays in IT has to do this. Now, in an ideal world, every company who sees the value of free software and begins using it would understand how precisely it creates value and how to engage with it effectively. However, and this is the interesting point, in the real world, things are not so neat and tidy. It's not so clean. Many companies adopted free software because their suppliers or their engineers or their customers wanted it. It happened organically. There was no strategic plan. It just occurred, and then occurred on greater scale, and continued occurring. There are consequences to that. This organic adoption without a strategic plan means that in some cases, there are no processes in place to properly deal with free software or to optimize their usage of it. I'm going to give you a little case study. A couple of years back, when I was in charge of Free Software Foundation Europe's legal department, there was a large community member that discovered what license compliance was about. One day, I got a telephone call from a journalist who asked me for a quote, saying that this very large company had deployed millions of products into people's homes with GPL code and was incompliant. And the journalist said, "What do you think about this?" And I hadn't heard about it. I hadn't heard anything about it, so I said to the journalist, "I'm going to call you right back." And I rang the company. At the time, that company was not a visible part of the free software community. In fact, we hadn't any direct contacts into them. So I went on this ricochet route through their support lines into their legal department, and eventually I got through to a trademark lawyer because apparently all the copyright lawyers were very busy right now. And I explained the case to the trademark lawyer that in a few hours, journalists are going live with a story that you're incompliant on products deployed into people's houses, and we're talking millions of units. And I'd like to talk with your people about whether it actually is a GPL issue and what we can do about it to try to manage expectations around compliance, about how you're going to come into compliance. And the trademark attorney listened to me and said, "Thanks for letting me know. Our copyright lawyers are pretty good. I'm pretty sure there's no problem." And he hung up. And of course, the journalist went live with the story, and then all of these engineers had a look at the actual product and found that, yeah, the product is incompliant. And Free Software Foundation Europe had a very interesting moment where we had to sit down and say, how are we going to respond to this? What's going to be our public messaging about this? I mean, we know that they're incompliant. We tried to talk with them, and, well, that didn't go so well. So what will we do? And we said to ourselves, this is actually a wonderful opportunity for this company and for the community at large to demonstrate how you can learn. This company was not a serial offender on something like license compliance. This was the first time we'd heard of an issue in one of their products. In fact, it was the first time that we were aware that this company was using free software to any large degree. And we took a public position saying they need to get into compliance. That's a given. They need to do it for this product and put in place processes to make sure they do it in the future. We also said, we're delighted that they're using free software, and we want to encourage them to use it in more products for many years to come. So that what we want to do is to assist this company in becoming a great community citizen. And what happened was the company actually entered into dialogue with us, and it basically said, oops, our bad, and now we want to learn. And they did. They flipped from having no proper compliance around free software in place to becoming very good at a lot of best practices and actually helping other companies as well in their supply chain and adjacent to them. And it was a tremendous example of a company not initially understanding how this community worked, basically approaching it in a way that indicated they hadn't analyzed it strategically, and then having a wake-up call and addressing it and getting on board and becoming a great community member and a great user of free software. Now, that indicates something very, very simple. It's not optimal for any company's return on investment or for the broader ecosystem sustainability to approach free software without a strategic plan. You're not going to be getting the best out of this ecosystem if you don't know what you're doing. And it's not going to be good for this ecosystem if stakeholders don't know what they're doing. Development, legal, and community best practice is simply important from a business perspective to reduce friction and to obtain maximum value. Whether you're worried about your public image, or you're worried about cease and desist on your products, or you're worried about the fact that if you don't collaborate with people and if the value's from collaboration, you're not going to get the value. It's obvious that best practice is the key. Compliance, and this is a very important point, compliance is not an end goal. It's part of a strategic investment in the ecosystem. It's part of one of many strategic investments that all long-term players make in this ecosystem for very good reasons. Free software, as an approach to managing technology, depends on shared rules so that the diverse stakeholders can work together. Those rules are not negotiable. We have reasons for our best practices. We've been refining this for decades. Now, Free Software Foundation Europe is an organization, a nonprofit organization that works to help support free software in Europe. The name gives most of it away. 10 years ago, Free Software Foundation Europe started a project to help support European organizations with all types of governance best practice. And the idea was to try to connect European projects and small businesses and large businesses with the knowledge and the people they need to improve their engagement with free software, to help them get the most out of it, and to build our community as a whole. We did various things in the legal department to get the ball rolling. 3 things I'll highlight here. One of them was very simple. We basically had a service where anyone could go to our webpage and ask questions. And that was incredibly popular. Tons of individuals, tons of projects, and surprising numbers of companies would approach us with all types of governance questions, ranging from questions of supply chain management to where did they find out more information about a license like the GPL. And we helped direct them, connect them. We helped, I suppose, link people, bridge people with the knowledge they needed to engage effectively with free software. And it was a wonderfully successful thing from the moment we began it in Europe, because until that point, in 2006, we didn't have any pan-European approach to dealing with these issues. Another thing we did at Free Software Foundation Europe was collaborating with GPL Violations.org on dozens of license compliance issues. There was never a shortage of companies that were making mistakes in their supply chain with code under various licenses like GPL. And we would collaborate with GPL Violations to help discuss those issues with companies and talk about how they can be addressed in this individual case and ongoing. And that was a collaboration that provided great results, ranging from enormous companies becoming great community citizens and pushing forward best practice, through to small companies that couldn't possibly afford to work these things out on their own, being connected with the knowledge and being able to get the support they needed to become good citizens in this community. Another thing we did was create a private network for counsel involved in free software. It's called the European Legal Network, that allowed these council to share knowledge around how the licenses worked, to share knowledge around how best practices work, to share knowledge about what they had discovered as legal professionals regarding not just the letters of each license, but the community expectations and the red lines in this field. And that network was incredibly successful. It scaled from 17 counsel in the first days quite quickly to over 300 participants across 28 countries and 4 continents. Now, until recently, it was still called the European Legal Network, even though it's now a global network. And they've just begun rebranding themselves as the Legal Network. It was a great resource to start and a success beyond our wildest dreams. In essence, encouraging the same type of collaboration between lawyers dealing with free software as we've had between developers dealing with free software for decades. Now, the engagement from multiple stakeholders, from small companies with 1 or 2 people through to multinationals in initiatives like this, and then their support in future initiatives to address challenges across the global supply chain is extremely significant. It indicates that people who are serious about doing well in free software, people who are serious about continuing to use it and continuing to derive value from it, get that what they have to do is to invest not just a bit of development time, but also to invest legal time and to invest in this as a strategic resource. They did, and they brought to fruition all types of interesting side initiatives over the years. For instance, it's not particularly well known outside of the lawyer groups, but there's a law journal dedicated to free software. It's called the International Free and Open Source Software Law Journal. And various large companies and so on have underwritten the costs of printing this peer-reviewed journal and placing it in law schools around the world. It's been going since 2009. There's also a book, the imaginatively titled International Free and Open Source Software Law Book, that covers copyright law and free software country by country to, in essence, help onboard companies and legal practitioners in this area to make sure that the knowledge of compliance goes deep. This is significant. It's indicative of an acknowledgement that free software is pretty much like every other aspect of business. The same maxim applies. Invest and grow is a much better long-term business strategy than grab and run. That's a simple but important concept. And it seems that a lot of companies go through the evolution of realizing that you need to invest if you want to keep getting value out of this area. Though most companies do, quite frankly, start with the grab and run approach. Understandably so, but it's not what you got to do to keep getting value here 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. Okay, so in my perspective, therefore, compliance has very little to do with the legal discourse alone. Compliance has everything to do with optimal investment in using free software, in extracting value from free software. And that's the message that I hope that you will bring back to every business meeting, every strategy meeting, every project heads meeting, that you must think about these issues because these issues are critical to us getting return on investment from playing in this field. Let's say that that argument is convincing to you, and let's say that that's enough management speak for now, and hand over, I think, to Harald Welte, the founder of GPL Violations.org, the first person to take the GPL license to court to explain the community and engineering side of things. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thanks, Shane. Yeah, so who am I, why am I here, who am I? Well, I think the most important points have been covered. I'm not a lawyer, I'm technical. I've been working on all kinds of different areas of technology, including Linux kernel development. I'm also doing electrical engineering, and I run my own company. So, I have been doing legal enforcement of the GPL in the Linux kernel for quite some time, and that basically is the reason why I'm here. And it's sort of a bit of a personal perspective on license compliance, but I think it's still an important message to get out there. And since we are talking about the communities and best practices of the communities and rules of the communities, well, I think it has to do a lot about the culture. And to explain sort of the culture that I was exposed to and that I literally was growing up with, well, where am I coming from? I mean, I was involved at a very young age in BBS communities, in Usenet. I started with doing some DOS shareware programming. I didn't know free software back then. I switched to Linux and other free software-based systems early on. Was getting involved in a non-for-profit ISP that started in Germany around that time. Then I got into NetFilter and IP tables, and all of these communities that I basically grew up with in my teenage years and beyond that were communities of enthusiasts, open to anyone without restriction, and information and code was shared freely to mutual benefit. And that's sort of the cultural background that somebody like me brings with him when he engages in license compliance and license enforcement. And I think that's sort of a bit of a background, a bit of an understanding of where that is coming from. So when we look at Linux and license compliance, until around 2000, Linux was still a very niche kind of operating system kernel, niche of the nerds. The long-bearded gurus, no offense, Mad Dog, used real Unix, at least that's what they thought back then. The rest of the world was trapped in a Microsoft Disneyland. And, GPL violations were not really heard of much until about 2002, when the first big round of embedded devices running Linux came out and were in compliance with the license. And when I first learned about that there were GPL violations, it made me actually very upset. It made me upset because, well, the industry that now started to use Linux ignored our culture, our rules and norms. I did not get upset about some legal details written in some license, but the fundamental issue is that they ignored the culture of sharing, they ignored the culture of collaboration, and that's really what got me motivated to do something. So these companies, they took what we had created, which is fine, free software, you can take it, but they did not even do the minimum of giving back those modifications they had made and did not provide the complete and corresponding source code in those products they created. And as those companies did not react to friendly reminders, I decided to start legal action back then. And how companies react in cases, Shane had already explained. You end up with a trademark lawyer who believes their colleagues are the best on the planet. And certainly there is no issue. So after the first couple of legal cases and enforcement, I started a project called GPL Violations.org, and the first actual legal cases were being filed in 2003. Actually, several hundred cases were handled over time. 100 cases means not like cases in front of a judge or in front of a court. Most of those cases where we encountered incompliant products were resolved out of court by legal proceedings before something goes to court. But also there are several court cases in my home country of Germany where I could enforce and uphold the rules set forth by the GNU General Public License in court, and we never lost a single case. All of those cases have been a success. So if some people claim that the GPL does not uphold in court and that it's not valid or something like that, I invite them very much to read up on the actual case history. All of those cases, including the English translation of the court rulings, are published. In the active phase of GPL Violations.org, I'm referring to that because the project has been dormant for a couple of years since I've got involved in other things that take up all of my time. Nevertheless, how does this enforcement work? Well, basically, we would look at new product announcements, look at flyers or vendor websites, look for suspicious-looking products where, let's say, a print server that also supports access or to interface with SMB file shares or something like that. Basically, from the features, you could already say, well, it's a small embedded device. It has this kind of features that chances are high it's going to run Linux and other free software inside. Then you go into an electronic store, you make test purchases, you buy the product. You look at the product, does it include source code or a link to the source code? Does it include the license text? Well, if not, well, you have to prove that your code is in there. So you start with disassembling the hardware, and disassembling in this case is mechanical disassembling, of course. Then you try to, by reverse techniques, find a serial console, find JTAG on that board, so you end up soldering wires to the circuit boards. People have actually written automatic JTAG brute forcers. So basically each and every test pad you find on a board, you solder a wire, you hook it up to a microcontroller, and then it tries to reverse engineer where is the long shift register of the JTAG, what's the JTAG pinout, and then basically recover from an undocumented piece of hardware how you can access JTAG. Remember, those days, we're talking about 2003, hardly any CPU had JTAG that you could disable. So well, if all of that didn't help, well, then you use your hot air rework station. You unsolder the memory chip, the NAND flash or the NOR flash or whatever it is. You take it out, you put it in a programmer, you dump the firmware. Or, as yesterday's keynote has illustrated, well, a lot of these devices have vulnerable network services. So if you can telnet in with admin, or you have a exploitable web interface of your router where you can put in a semicolon somewhere in a field or something like that that gives you access to execution on the device itself, you can of course also go that route. And in the end, you end up with a firmware image of some sort of the device. This firmware image is often, or at least back these days, was often in proprietary format, so you had to actually unpack that in some way, reverse engineer the file format. Once you decompressed it, quite often they would even use compression methods or packaging of compression that is not standard. Then you search for strings and symbols and so on code where I, in that case, hold copyright on. And once all that is established, well, you can go to the legal part. But this is actually the fun part. It's still technical, and you get to play with technology and get to understand and reverse engineer it. You know, some people like to do Sudoku. I think it's much more fun to try to reverse engineer some embedded device. It's also very rewarding, I can tell you. So, well, then the legal part starts, which may be fun to some people, and I think it's not boring either, but it is time consuming. So you start with explaining the evidence to your lawyer. You start reviewing the legal briefs going back and forth between the both parties. You spend lots of time to try to teach corporate legal departments what is natural to you because you've been growing up with this as a teenager already. And I'm not that young anymore, so this is already quite some time ago. And over time, it makes you frustrated and upset. You started with being frustrated by the behavior of the companies to begin with, and you become more frustrated and upset because it eats up your time. Well, not only do they basically not respect the rules of the community, but then they also keep eating up my time so I can spend less time on code, and they force me to take legal risks so that they actually do what they're supposed to do from the beginning. And then this process starts all over again with every company or every department of every company or every device of every department of every company that gets introduced in new markets. Because once you have all the vendors of DSL routers in compliance, well, Linux shows up on mobile phone, and then you have all the vendors of Android phones. And then it shows up in other devices, and again, these are different markets, different companies that engage in such markets, and the story starts all over again. So that's a little bit frustrating over time. So let's take a step back. Well, companies start to work on or with Linux without following a collaborative development model, which of course is fine. They can do that. Their management is free to ignore the decade-old experience and requests by the community to work in mainline, to submit their code, you know, to follow the community development model from begin with. That's fine. They can ignore that. That's possible. They can also ignore their own engineers' request who might understand the development model and want to contribute and basically tell them, no, 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 we do this out of tree, you will not work in mainline, you do not participate on public mailing lists. They can do that, they can ignore that. But then what happens? Well, they release incompliant products, the community gets upset because the management did not enable them or allow them or require to do their development in the regular collaborative process. And engage and encourage their engineers to contribute that code back to mainline. And then, well, somebody like GPL Violations.org uses the legal vehicle of copyright enforcement, which senior management can no longer ignore because, well, there are legal threats and the legal department you cannot ignore. So then we get their attention. And the result, which in many cases is where we are today, is that this senior management asks their lawyers, well, what do we need to do to comply to the absolute legally minimum that is required so we do not get into any kind of legal trouble? Which means they still do not follow a collaborative development process. They still do not contribute to mainline. They still do not participate on mailing lists, which is what we as a community actually want from the beginning. But now they try to look at it from a very legalese point of view and do whatever is necessary to comply with the license. So what we have is what I call, as an engineer, a cultural impedance mismatch. Electrical engineering term, my apologies. And well, free software is about collaborative development. It's about participating on mailing lists, developing code in public repositories, using fine-grained commits, jointly develop software. It's not about procrastinating over legal issues. And what the free software developers really want is collaboration and not pure license compliance. Of course, we also want license compliance, but as Shane already pointed out, that's not an end goal. That's sort of the legal way of how to do this. The GPL is called a legal hack. It's basically a legal hack to ensure that, well, what we can use copyright in a way to ensure that at least the bare minimum is being done by those companies who use the code under the license. But it suffers also, again, from an impedance mismatch between what you can do in a license text under copyright law and what developers actually want in terms of a collaborative software development model. So it's focusing on just legal compliance without a lack of understanding of sort of the development model. So GPL compliance should be driven by engineering and maybe business reasons, but not primarily by legal, which is sort of what happened these days. Now, let's talk a bit about cultural differences. Cultural differences exist between any set of two cultures that you find, I think. Think, for example, of, well, Western versus Asian, which is, of course, stupid because, well, there is no Western and no single Asian culture. There are many cultures. But, you know, take a couple of examples that I think everyone in this room will be able to relate to. So think of Westerners, what is considered rude. I mean, if I'm a Western, I travel to Asian countries, well, I should not stick chopsticks in a rice bowl anywhere in Asia. I think everyone knows that. I should not have loud phone conversations on a Japanese train. Everyone who's been to Japan should know that. You'd never want to split a restaurant bill if you're invited to a restaurant by a Chinese business partner. You should not do that. You should not decline to accept if soju is offered by your Korean host. And you should not, as I have learned visiting Thailand, you should not put Buddha statues' heads and use them as decoration. It's impolite. You should not do that. These are cultural norms, and if you enter those cultures, it's a good idea to respect those cultures. So, nevertheless, being a European idiot coming to Asia, likely I make mistakes, and due to these cultural differences. And those differences may people, or some people at least, cause them to be annoyed or upset with my behavior here. How could I not know that? How could I not at least inform myself about the culture that I'm traveling to? And I think that's not actually so different from an electronics company or a software company that deals with proprietary software from entering the free software area. It's not that different. So if we look at license compliance in the industry in many cases in 2016, as I see it, well, there are lots of parts of the Linux or embedded Linux industry that make a lot of effort now to comply with the legal requirements, establishing the required release and business processes, using free software and proprietary tools that can aid you with license compliance, They may engage them in the legal network created by the FSFE that Shane has indicated, but it's driven by legal threats. It's not driven by understanding the value of a collaborative development process and by really engaging with the community. And that's sort of sad, because it is like complying with environmental standards that are set forth by law. It's like, oh yeah, okay, we have to save greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, we do that. Or some other regulatory requirements. It's not really something that companies tend to be excited about and tend to think this is really something they want to do because it brings benefit to them. And bringing back the analogy about the cultural impedance mismatch, basically, well, now our European or American Western travelers complies with the local laws by not bringing restricted items such as medication or too long pocket knives or something like that into the Asian country, even though they might be legal at his home. So that's legal compliance with the local laws. But then he still often ignores the local culture and the social norms in that community, and is perceived by some of the locals as disrespectful and rude at times, because that doesn't cause legal risks. It just means you cannot really deal as efficiently with the locals. It means you know, you don't follow really the culture of that world that you have entered. And well, so in summary, to put them together, well, the legal to the letter compliance, if you may call it that way, has significantly improved over the last 15 years that I have been looking into GPL compliance and GPL enforcement. That's good. Awareness that license compliance is required, that is mandatory and you cannot avoid it, and that is also widely present, and I appreciate that, and it's a big progress. But then collaborative free and open source software development is becoming more frequent, but to a much lesser extent than what we see in terms of the legal to the letter compliance. And we still see quite a number of companies, particularly those that enter the free software world for a shorter time, not for a long time yet, that, well, basically they don't think about compliance, they don't think about collaborative development, they don't work in mainline, they don't participate in the mailing lists, and that still makes me sad to some extent. So maybe another analogy is, well, you can have a marriage that caters exclusively to one of the two partners, but then will that be a sustainable long-time relationship? Or will that be a short affair with a divorce and lawsuits and whatnot associated with that? So I think it's actually not such a strange concept that nobody can relate to, and it's so foreign. I think it's a normal process that you can find in many other aspects of life or areas of life, just as traveling to Asia in my other example. So I think the most important way ahead, or the most important focus should be to shift the focus from the legal-centric GPL compliance that we have now to an engineering-centric collaborative development, which of course includes legal compliance, but it comes naturally at that point. It's not something that you specifically look at from the legal point of view exclusively. Okay, well, that's basically my take on this, and now you have a license to ask questions to Shane and me on what we have just presented. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for having me.
John's got a question.
So, cultural, I guess you'll repeat the question, right?
Yeah, I will repeat the question.
So, cultural sensitivity training sounds like a really good idea. How do you get people to accept? Your analogy is perfect, but how do you get people to see that at a broader scale?
That's a good question. I don't have, sorry, repeating the question. Yeah, the question was, well, my analogy was perceived as a good analogy, and how do we get more people to see that and to sort of spread the message? And I don't really have a good response to that. You know, talk about it, explain it, share the message, but I don't have a master plan for that. Sorry. Yeah, over there.
I liked both of your analogies. I thought both of them are illustrative. Traveling to an Asian country, you're expected to adopt their customs. A marriage is a joint activity, and both parties need to adapt to each other, right? So I think, you know, I agree with everything you say. A lot of business needs to learn about community, but I think community needs to learn about the realities of business, and sometimes it's not just not wanting to share, it's just impedance mismatch that, you know, the business goals don't quite match, and sometimes it's to get to the better collaboration, not the compliance. Obviously, the compliance has to be there. But so, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly understand that the goals of businesses are different than the goals of community, and it's often hard to sort of combine the two or find a common ground for both sides. And I'm not saying everyone must always work in a collaborative development model, but I would hope that in many cases, at least a large proportion of the industry would understand that it is of mutual long-term benefit to work in such a model.
If I may interject, I think that one important point you raised there was community understanding of business situations, and that does come up. I think it's a given that if people want to play in this community, they have to understand the community norms. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that community members must understand that various things are happening in the background, like, for instance, the supply chain, where you might have 9 hops through it and a thicket of contracts to get through to find the source code that you didn't know was needed until right now. And I think that we can't, on the community side, assume bad faith. And that's a very important thing. We need to assume that something's gone wrong and it must be fixed, and that's not negotiable. But I think there is a learning process as well, finding out things. With Free Software Foundation Europe's legal department, it was illuminating to see how tangled supply chain logistics are for things like code, and how all kinds of errors are introduced essentially out of the current process control that companies had. And the real question there was, how do we adjust the processes? But that also took understanding regarding timescales and renegotiation. So I think that's an interesting and valid point. Ah, yes, Mad Dog.
I think there's also a problem of inertia. So you talked about the managers who refuse to let their employees do the right thing by contributing back. When did those managers actually go to school to learn their business practices, which was 20 or 30 years ago? And until you have the people who are now in university being trained in these business practices and licensing going forward to become the managers, you're always going to have a kind of catch-up to that. So one of the things I'm trying to do is, through the Linux Professional Institute, to actually have a certification for free software managers, to say, yes, you have to know about this licensing, you have to understand the concept of open source and collaboration, and you still have a business decision to make, whether you're going to accept that or not. But if you don't accept it, then you can't participate. You can't play the game, okay? So we have to do that, and we have to get the existing managers to go back and retrain themselves to that. Otherwise, we'll continually be playing catch-up.
It's a wonderful point, and I think I'd call out Chinese companies like Tencent especially as leading the charge in trying to put more and more education around free software into universities. And Mad Dog, I'm delighted to hear about this LPI initiative. I think that's absolutely necessary.
Okay, so another issue which corporates have is intellectual property. So what's your position? Because there are cases where you want to contribute, but intellectual property that actually is your real intellectual property makes it prohibitive, because licensing is unclear, so you don't know if you give away your intellectual property that you invested in doing just to contribute back your changes to open source code. So what's your position on that?
Can we let Harald go first? Because I'm just curious what he's going to say.
Well, I mean, okay. Call me a radicalist, but I don't like the concept or the word of intellectual property in the first point. How can I say? Well, everybody who works on the Linux kernel and writes code and submits it mainline, what do they do with their intellectual property? They share it. I mean, and they keep their copyright, and they license the code under GPL and they distribute it. So how can I say, if I'm not, I don't know about the specific case, but if you implement something and you think, well, oh, this is my intellectual property, and how can I put this in the Linux kernel or in a free software project? Well, I mean, you couldn't use the Linux kernel in the first place if everybody would be thinking that way. So that's sort of my take on that question, but maybe I misunderstood it.
Well, I mean, there's actually cases where you have intellectual property that someone else has put in. You might not want to pursue legal action, but that actually prohibits you from contributing, because then you would give away that intellectual property, even though you didn't contribute it in the first place.
Well, I think what I'd like to do here is put on a super kind of businessy negotiation hat. So I've done a lot of work negotiating with companies around areas which fall very much under the intellectual property zone. For instance, as Global Director of Licensing at Open Invention Network, a lot of discussions regarding patents and so on. And a lot of companies do have a lot of creative goods that they have essentially developed at cost, great cost, and are thinking about what that means and what their engagement with free software means and how they're going to balance that. But it really comes down to a pure business decision in the end. If you can re-engineer a multi-billion-dollar platform on your own and do that on your own, then that's how you can keep all of the intellectual property that you would need around that platform in-house. But if you want to play with other people's intellectual property under licenses that require that you will also collaborate, you're going to have to make some compromises. And it's really a business decision about, where is my value? You know, where am I deriving value out of this? And if you look at your, let's say, your intellectual property and think, this is worth $40 billion, and my value from this stuff is $10 billion, then your equation is pretty clear as a business manager. But if you look at it and think, well, this piece of code might have, let's say, these patents applicable to it, or these copyrights with this amount of engineering time, and that's worth X amount of thousands or X amount of millions, but we're getting a multi-billion-dollar platform. Then you just think, well, that's not a bad deal. And I think that's the business equation that happens in enlightened discourse with intellectual property and free software. It's about understanding that you get a multiple of your investment from playing in this field. And it's understandable that people might want to not grant anything, but that's also against the very fundamental reason that people are able to participate and act in this community. You can't use third-party intellectual property for completely free. And in free software, the one term is that you got to collaborate. You got to play by the licenses. That's the one cost. And I think that's the balance. It's not free, as in no cost at all, but it's not a high barrier to entry for what you get. And you just have to negotiate that out with your processes.
Okay, I'm sorry that we're running out of time. So
I think I have really appreciated all the questions and the interaction with the audience. Thank you very much to Harald and Shane.